If it's Wednesday, Colorado's highest court disqualifies former President Trump from appearing on the state's presidential primary ballot for engaging in the January 6th insurrection. Plus, NBC News exclusive reporting on Chinese President Xi Jinping's blunt and private warning to President Biden last month that he's planning to retake Taiwan without a military confrontation. And a record surge of migrant crossings at the southern border shows no signs of slowing down. I'll speak with the leader of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, with lawmakers now aiming to strike an immigration deal in the new year. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake in Washington, where the Supreme Court is now poised to play an even greater role in the 2024 election after Colorado's highest court barred Donald Trump from appearing on that state's presidential primary ballot. In an explosive 4-3 decision late yesterday, the state Supreme Court ruled that the former president and current Republican frontrunner violated the 14th Amendment's insurrection clause and was therefore disqualified from holding the office of president. The court's Democratic majority found that, quote, President Trump did not merely incite the January 6th insurrection. Even when the siege on the Capitol was fully underway, he continued to support it. These actions constituted overt, voluntary, and direct participation in the insurrection. The court put its own ruling on pause to allow for an appeal to the Supreme Court, which the Trump team says it plans to do. President Biden addressed the court's decision today on his way to an event in Wisconsin.
Well, I think certain things are self-evident. You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, I'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero. And he seems to be doubling down on about everything.
Former President Trump didn't mention the ruling during a rally last night in Iowa, although his campaign is already fundraising off the news. And Republicans are rallying behind their primary frontrunner, including the ones running against him.
I expect that to be reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think the precedent that a court could just take somebody off the ballot without even any type of criminal conviction or anything like that, I think that is not the way the law is intended to be enforced.
We don't need to have judges making these decisions. We need voters to make these decisions. So I want to see this in the hands of the voters.
And so, actually, on the way on the bus ride over here, I said that I would, from Colorado's GOP primary, withdraw from that name and require every other Republican in this race to do the same thing, at least until every candidate actually gets to run.
I do not believe Donald Trump should be prevented from being president of the United States by any court. I think he should be prevented from being president of the United States by the voters of this country.
So brace yourself, folks, because an unprecedented web of legal and constitutional questions facing a criminally indicted presidential frontrunner who's accused of engaging in an insurrection has now gotten somehow even more unprecedented as we head into an election year in which the courtroom may matter just as much, if not more, than what happens on the campaign trail. Joining me now is NBC's Vaughn Hilliard covering the Trump campaign, NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett, and Nate Persily, professor at Stanford Law School focusing on election law and a former senior research director for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. So, Laura, for those of us who struggled with the high school history part of this, walk us through exactly what the 14th Amendment says and why it may apply in this case.
Okay, I feel like I'm being put on the spot here with a Stanford law professor, but let me do my best. The basic principle here is that the Constitution, Section 3, 14th Amendment, says if you are an officer of the United States, Garrett, you take an oath to protect that Constitution. You cannot then engage in an insurrection or give comfort to our enemies and then actually be able to hold public office again. The basic idea was you don't get the privilege of holding office if you have engaged in an insurrection. And in this case, the court in Colorado, as you said, by a vote of 4-3, decided, yes, he engaged in an insurrection on January 6th, and yes, he actually counts as an officer of the United States, even though the text of that clause that you just put up doesn't actually say and spell out in plain English it applies to the president. They're reading that that into it. They're deciding that it should fill the gaps there. But that's the debate that's been raging. Is he an officer of the United States? It's a very technical, legal debate that is the kind of debate you'd have in law school. But now the courts are going to be the ones to have to weigh in on this.
All right, well, let's turn to our law professor then. Professor, do you believe that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does apply to the office of the presidency? And what about the idea of enforcement authority? No court has found Trump guilty of this. Can the Supreme Court of Colorado on their own say, yes, in fact, we think he's guilty of this and we're going to enforce that clause?
Well, let me first say that Laura gets an A. That I think is a very good assessment of the constitutional issues in this case. Let's be clear. We're kind of walking in new snow here. This is not something that the Supreme Court has had to deal with before. But the contrary argument is that a president could, basically support a revolution and then appear on the ballot in the next election. Mm-hmm. And so you're right that there is a fundamental question here as to whether he needs to be convicted by a court of insurrection before he could be removed from the ballot. But what this court said is that, look, that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is self-executing, that we are going to determine whether he participated in an insurrection. Here are the facts of January 6th. He engaged in it, and so therefore he should be taken off the ballot.
All right, so Vaughn, we saw a very coordinated response from Trump world in the aftermath of this. They sure sound mad, are they?
Well, they'll be mad if the Supreme Court ultimately kicks him off the ballot here. But, Garrett, you well know that they make a legal battle a political battle. And the pressure, this is what we saw after the search warrant execution by the FBI of Mar-a-Lago in August of last year, and we saw this after each of the 4 criminal indictments this year, was that the pressure was on the likes of his Republican political rivals, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, to coalesce and come to his defense. And that is what you have seen each of them, even including Chris Christie, do, suggesting it should be the voters who choose whether Donald Trump is back in the White House or not the court system. We should note there is one presidential candidate, Asa Hutchinson, who has been on the front lines, including at that first debate, suggesting that, in fact, that Donald Trump was part of an insurrection and should be removed from the ballot. But Asa Hutchinson is not the most popular figure in the Republican Party for that stance, sitting at about 1%. The Trump campaign, Garrett, just sent out a fundraising email here this afternoon in which they make it clear, saying, quote, Crooked Joe and the Democrats know they can't beat us at the ballot box. So their new plan is to nullify every single Trump ballot in the nation to keep Biden in the White House.
The great irony of the let voters choose defense is that's exactly what Donald Trump is accused of not doing here by trying to overturn the election results in 2020. But that seems lost on some of this debate. So, Laura, the grinding sound we could hear just down the street from the Supreme Court was probably John Roberts gnashing his teeth over this, right? I mean, how do we expect the Supreme Court's going to view taking this up by January 4th, which is to the point to which this ruling is stayed? They don't want to have to wade into this, but how can they not now?
So part of the problem here is the context of sort of, I think, the shrapnel, if you will, of Bush v. Gore, right? Sort of the lessons of that and how the court's integrity was tested like never before. And now, once again, they're going to be forced in one way or another. If it's not this Colorado case, it's another case that we saw the former president weighing in about whether or not he should be able to be protected by some sort of presidential immunity from any prosecution. That's another one that's being teed up for the Supreme Court's review any time, really, now that all the briefs are in. And so one way or another, Chief Justice John Roberts is going to have to make a call on one of these Trump-related cases. And it's going to be anybody's guess about which one goes first. The one as it relates to Colorado, if they wanted to, they could really sit on it in a way, because that one, at least for right now, has a pause. It has a stay because the court recognized it was doing something bold. So it put its own ruling on hold to give him the opportunity to appeal. The presidential immunity one, Jack Smith, the special counsel, has teed that up for their review right now. He's saying we are so interested in getting a resolution, a firm answer to the question about whether he should be protected from prosecution. We want the Supreme Court to rule on that one right away. But guys, if it's not any one of those two, it's going to be something else. Something is going to be on their doorstep, whether they like it or not, for the Republican frontrunner of this election. And they're going to be in the driver's seat here in a way that they may be uncomfortable with, but not able to avoid.
Well, to that end, let's put that map back up on screen, because this is not the last of one of these challenges that we might see at a state level to Donald Trump's ballot access. So, Professor, if the court decides to sit on this, as Laura suggests they could in Colorado, what happens when it comes up in Nevada or in Texas or some other state whose electoral votes might matter a great deal to this contest?
Well, I think the Supreme Court really does need to take this case, and it really should answer this question before January 4th. We need to know what the rules are of this election. This applies beyond this particular case, but any of these election controversies. We're not in a political system right now that can take all that much ambiguity. And so I think with respect to your specific question, at least the Colorado Republican Party has now said that if this decision holds, that they will go and have a caucus to sort of take it out of the state-approved mechanisms of the primary election. And so I think that ultimately the court is going to have to answer one of these cases, but it's better to do it sooner, because you don't want the sort of the ballots to be cast in the primary and then to have to answer the question after the fact to remove someone who's been duly nominated by the party.
My understanding is that caucus question in Colorado is still a little bit of a live ball. But, Vaughn, I want to turn to you. I want to ask you about one of the other cases here that Laura alluded to, this idea that Trump has until today, as I understand it, to respond to the special counsel's request that the Supreme Court rule on whether he has immunity in the D.C. election interference case, the big Jack Smith January 6th case. Has the former president responded there yet? What do we expect to see from him there?
Actually, here just this afternoon, Garrett, we now have that filing. It's a 34-page filing from Trump's legal team to the U.S. Supreme Court, laying out why they believe the appeal that the decision made by Judge Chutkan, who is overseeing his federal election interference case, should, in terms of the grounds in which he is protected by executive privilege, whether the Trump campaign's appeal should go directly to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, or should it bypass them and go to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is what Jack Smith's team wants to do. They fear having this trial delayed beyond March 4th. And what in this filing the Trump lawyers lay out is the argument that it is not in the public interest, as Jack Smith's team lays out, to have this expedited directly to the Supreme Court to be heard, and that instead, if in fact the public interest is in mind, then the justice system and the legal system should be able to play out through each of its normal steps. We now should be able to hear from the U.S. Supreme Court in the coming days whether they will accept this and bypass the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, or whether January 9th is the first day of the oral arguments that the Court of Appeals would hear it. And again, March 4th is that first day of that election interference trial. And the question mark, will it begin March 4th? Because if it lasts 3 months, that trial, it's in the heart of the summer, and we're looking at July and the Republican National Convention right around the bend.
Nate, on the insurrection question, I mean, I was there on January 6th. I've written, I don't even know how many scripts about what happened that day. And every time we do, there's sort of this debate about the question of insurrection, if it's a politically loaded term, who decides what's an insurrection or who's not. I mean, it sounds like semantics, but how much of that case comes down to that question? Insurrection, is that what happened at January 6th, and did Trump do it, right? Like, have we ever sort of definitively answered that question, and who gets to from a legal standpoint?
Well, that's what the Supreme Court is going to answer, not only what is an insurrection, but who gets to decide. Because it's quite possible that the Supreme Court's going to say that Congress needs to define what an insurrection is, and then there has to be a prosecution of a potential candidate under that statute and a conviction before that person could be disqualified from office. And so, what the Colorado Supreme Court was saying, which, by the way, is consistent with what the district court that tried the case said, is that, yes, he participated in insurrection. He tried to disrupt an official proceeding that would have led to the peaceful transfer of power. And that is enough under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. We don't need to have a criminal conviction in order to prevent him from running for office.
So, Laura, as I'm trying to get my head around this, if you can't convict a former president for something that he did because he was immune, but you can't kick him off a ballot because he hasn't been convicted, and if he can't be impeached because he's not the president anymore, Is there any mechanism left to hold a exiting or former president responsible for something like this? Or did Donald Trump find a loophole here to make himself basically like a politically bulletproof figure?
I think it's a great sort of encapsulation of the trick box that we find ourselves in. But I think it is important to sort of tease out the issues, right, Garrett? Because Jack Smith, the special counsel in D.C., hasn't charged the former president with inciting an insurrection. He's charging the president with something very distinct about trying to obstruct the vote count by putting forth a false slate of electors. So the whole question of not whether or not he's immune or anything like that doesn't actually hinge, at least in that case, on whether or not he incited an insurrection. It's helpful color in telling that story to the jury, but it's actually very different than what the Colorado case is looking at. And so I think that obviously there's a lot of overlap and a lot of confusion here, but the court, I think, does have the opportunities, if we're thinking about accountability and who should decide, to sort of take these in slow, meaningful pieces to try to give people a little bit of guidance about what the rules of the road should be going forward.
All right, we got to leave it there. We will end our legal seminar. Vaughn and I are going to keep copying Laura's notes. Professor, thank you also for your time and expertise on this. I want to turn now to some other breaking news on another topic, where the White House announced late today that it had reached a deal with the Venezuelan government to free 10 Americans jailed in Venezuela, some designated as wrongfully detained. Those Americans are now on their way home. The Biden administration says Venezuela has also extradited Leonard Francis, also known as Fat Leonard, the fugitive defense contractor who was at the center of one of the worst bribery scandals in U.S. Navy history. The White House says that Venezuela has also agreed to release 20 Venezuelan political prisoners. Now, in return, the U.S. is releasing Alex Saab. He's a Colombian businessman and a close Maduro ally who's been in U.S. custody since 2020, facing money laundering charges. A senior administration official says Biden had to make an extremely difficult decision here, but decided to grant clemency to Saab, who is still awaiting trial. Now, already this prisoner swap is drawing some criticism from both Democrats and from Republicans, including Senator Marco Rubio, the ranking member of the Senate Intel Committee and a staunch critic of the Maduro regime, who called the move shameless. Coming up, how the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling is playing on the campaign trail and what it means for the former president's political future. But first, how House Republicans are grappling with the politics of a presidential impeachment inquiry as their own presidential frontrunner faces unprecedented legal liabilities of his own. My one-on-one interview with a Republican Congressman, Don Bacon, is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Republicans are once again rallying around Donald Trump in the face of legal trouble. But with 2024 just around the corner now, that support could have political consequences, both on the campaign trail and on Capitol Hill, as Congress faces a jam-packed January of its own. Joining me now is Nebraska Republican Congressman Don Bacon. And Congressman, thank you for being here. I want to start with your reaction to yesterday's Colorado Supreme Court ruling. Last year on Meet the Press, you criticized the president for his actions on January 6th. What do you make of this ruling and the fact that it concludes that Trump engaged in insurrection on the 6th?
You know, I'm not a lawyer. And first of all, thanks for having me on. I'm not a lawyer, but I suspect the Supreme Court will likely overturn this. I think the number one concern I hear, and I would agree, the president's not been found guilty yet, through the impeachment process or through the special prosecutor. And so you would think he'd have to at least be found guilty in court or previously through the impeachment before Colorado could rule this way. So I suspect the Supreme Court will take this on and likely will be overturned.
Are you confident that there is a mechanism to find him guilty, though? I mean, the Republicans wouldn't vote for his conviction on impeachment or on impeaching him because he was out of office. Now he's arguing he's immune because these are actions that he took while he was president. If none of that works and he can't be kicked off the ballot here by judges, how do you hold somebody like him accountable?
Well, you know, there's 4 different sets of indictments that are going on right now, and one of them is over January 6th and the events leading up to it. And I really think that is a legitimate area where the president could be scrutinized. You know, for us, the impeachment occurred after he left. Right. We weren't even sure at the time if that was the right way to go. So I do think it's through, you know, the courts right now that if a prosecutor wants to come forward, that this is the proper forum to have that happen. So there's a possibility he could be found guilty, and in that case, there could be, grounds for Colorado or other states to do this. But until there's a guilty finding by a jury or a judge, I don't see how states can do this.
What do you make of the manner in which so much of the party has rallied around Donald Trump every time we've seen some of these new legal challenges? Does that tell us more about the challenges themselves? Does it tell us more about the party? And what does that tell you about, his chances going forward, both in the primary and in November?
Well, there's two probably different perspectives. There is roughly half or 50% in the polling. You would say that they think a lot of these charges are political. Mm-hmm. And like here with Colorado, he's not even been found guilty yet, and yet he's being taken off the ballot. I think others are concerned. We're looking at 90 different indictments as well. And I want to get a Republican in the White House. And I want someone that can carry our message strongly, whether it's the border, strengthening our alliances, getting our spending under control. And I think it's more important for me to make sure we have someone, the most competitive person we can get in there to actually take the White House back. Because it's hard to overcome a president that's liberal or left of center. We see it with Joe Biden. His executive orders are hurting us at the border. They're hurting us in the military. And so I'm for trying to get the best candidate we can that can take it back. So I think the indictments hurt him in winning a year from now or next November.
When you guys come back to Washington next year, the impeachment inquiry, I think, is going to be one of the issues on the front burner. Ahead of last week's vote, you had said that the inquiry doesn't necessarily mean you have high crimes or misdemeanors. You said at the time that you might not ever know that. I wonder what you make of the possibility that this inquiry is something that just stays open through the election. Or would you be prepared to acquit President Biden if you never see evidence that meets your standards here?
Well, we should go where the evidence lies. Frankly, I was opposed to an inquiry 3 or 4 months ago because the president was providing all the information that was being subpoenaed. But 3 weeks ago, he put in a letter that since we didn't have a formal inquiry vote, they didn't have to provide the information that was being requested. So I felt like he forced our hand in doing the inquiry. I suspect, or I think most Americans look at what's going on here, $24 million in foreign money, 20 LLCs to help move the money around. We want to just get to the truth of that. And my view of it is there may not be a high crime or misdemeanor, but it sure looks bad. And I think it's corruption using the family name. And I think the voters should just know the truth. And if it bothers them, okay, they're going to vote one way. If it doesn't, they'll vote another way. But I think our job is to provide the truth and let the voters decide.
Do you have any sense of how long this inquiry is expected to last? Is that something y'all have talked about behind closed doors here? Not to put a lot of pressure on you, Congressman, but you guys have a lot of real work to get done in January when you get back.
Well, we do have 20 committees, and you're right, there's 2 committees that are focused on this. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, the Ag Committee. We put no focus on the impeachment, so we'll be getting a lot of other things done. But I don't want to make this political. And obviously impeachment's going to have some political aspects to it. I don't think impeachments are good for our country. And it should be a very clear high crime or misdemeanor. And we should do this by the book, methodical. I think we should do this more Watergate style. I think the Democrats in the last Congress, or Speaker Pelosi anyway, cut corners on both impeachments. And we should do this by the book and methodical. But once we realize there is not a high crime or misdemeanor, we should move on. We should treat the American people right on this and play it by the book.
I mean, I would argue that impeachments are almost entirely a political exercise, but I take your point. Do you worry at all that the voters, the American public broadly, just kind of isn't where Washington is anymore on impeachment? The last 2 impeachments did not appear to have much of an impact on Donald Trump. I guess you could argue about the second one, but certainly not the first one. Do you think the American public cares about this issue in any substantive way anymore?
I think they do, but I've heard from voters both ways on this. I've heard from some they don't like the inquiry. I've heard from others thanking me for voting that way. Let's be honest, though. If this is perceived as being a revenge impeachment or a politicized impeachment, and as you say, all impeachments have political aspects to it, but if it's seen as being as a political weapon, it will hurt the Republicans. So we should be very careful and do this right. I think the impeachments hurt the Democrats. They went backwards in both elections. I think the impeachment under Bill Clinton hurt the Republicans, if my history is right on that.
That's right.
So if we don't handle this right, and if it looks like we're using it as a political weapon, we'll come back to bite us. So I encourage our team to be very, very cautious and prudent in how we go forward.
Congressman, last question. This Congress that just concluded, this year of Congress just concluded, is going to go down in history as one of the least productive Congresses in modern history. Can you tell the American people that a Republican-controlled House is going to get more done next year than you were able to do in your first year in the majority?
I would say yes, but what we've seen this past year is divided government. And
which you'll still have next year.
We have a two-seat majority in the House out of 435 members, a two-seat majority in the Senate, different parties. I think the biggest thing we have to get done is solving the border crisis. It's the worst it's ever been. We had 14,000 people come in one day this week. You know, under President Obama, the metric was 1,000. It was over 1,000 was seen as an emergency. So I think we're close to getting an agreement with the Senate, House, with Republicans and Democrats. And that's been the challenge. We can pass things out of the House, but we necessarily can't get that same legislation through the Senate. We got to work together and find areas of consensus. And I appreciate Senator Sinema, Senator Langford, Senator Murphy. By the way, I met with them in the Senate. I think they're about 90, 95%. But that could be a great win for America. Wow. And we also need to get a budget line number early so that we can do appropriations in a much more decent way. It's not right to our military or all the other parts of our government to have 4 or 5 months of CRs or continuing resolutions like we're doing now. Well, so
Congressman,
if we get a top line early, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, we got to leave it there. That's a Christmas wish list for this next Congress that even Santa would blush at. But we got to stop there.
I'm an optimist.
I appreciate that. John Bacon, thank you for being with us. You have teased our next segment quite well, because up next, we've got rising concerns among some of the president's closest allies after he offers significant compromises to Republicans on the issue of border security. Congressional Hispanic Caucus Chair and Democratic Congresswoman Nanette Barragán joins me next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. It's official. There will be no deal made on border policies in 2023 as the Senate headed home for the holidays today. This morning, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that he remains committed to passing a national security supplemental, which includes border policies as well as aid to Ukraine and Israel in the new year. I'm joined now by the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Democratic Congresswoman from California, Nanette Barragán. So, Congresswoman, I don't know if you heard that from Don Bacon. He seems to think these negotiations are quite close to concluding, but we know the Senate has punted at least any vote till 2024. What do you know about the current state of these negotiations?
Well, thanks for having me, Garrett. The state of the negotiations is that they're continuing to do everything they can to get a deal done. But that continues to be a concern for me and members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. You're talking about significant changes to immigration policy, but not without a single CHC member at the table, whether it's a senator or a House member. That's just unacceptable. That would be like a deal on civil rights and voting rights without a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. It would just be unheard of.
So what are you asking for here? I mean, are you just trying to get CHC members in the room? Do you want to be more involved through the White House? Like, what's the solution to the process problem here from your perspective?
Well, first of all, we need to be in the room. Somebody needs to be in the room to represent our communities and our voice. That's the first thing. But the other thing, Garrett, is that I don't think you should be talking about a border and immigration policy changes in the same foreign aid package. And I think that's a mistake. Because it's not a negotiation. It really is a hostage taking. Republicans have taken critical foreign aid dollars that are needed and saying, we're not going to give it unless you give us all these things. And some of these things, as we know, there's no way they could pass through regular order. And we're not getting anything in exchange. You know, Americans want border security. They want pathways to citizenship and things that are going to uplift immigrants. And this is not that. This is more deportations. This is more going into different parts of the country and having folks deported. This is calling for mass incarceration, which is going to mean we would have to build massive private prisons along the southern border. This is trying to put an end to things like parole, which is a tool to actually have a orderly, humane migration. So what Republicans are talking about here are not going to fix the problem at the southern border. And so, I would argue it's going to make things worse.
So a couple things. I mean, it was the White House that linked border policies, or at least the border issue, with, the foreign aid when they sent this supplemental down. That wasn't just Republicans. Although I take your point that has become the overwhelming force of discussion here. You've outlined some of the things you don't like, at least what we know is being discussed in these immigration negotiations. But I wonder, do you accept the premise, and you just heard some of this from Don Bacon, that if 1,000 people a day was a crisis under Obama, that 12,000 people a day is a major crisis now, that something has to be done quite quickly on the southern border?
There is no disagreement that something has to be done. And this is where we are all in agreement. By the way, Republicans are the ones that are saying no to millions of dollars in more Border Patrol agents. They're saying no to millions of dollars and more CBP officers. They're saying no to $1 billion in ICE detention beds. They're saying no to millions of dollars to fight fentanyl crossing the border. So we need to put money into things like more capacity, more infrastructure to process people, more legal pathways. These are the things that we know have worked. If you take a look at what happened in October of last year, when you saw Title 42 in place, border crossings were higher. Well, there was more apprehensions in October of last year than there was October of this year when you had no Title 42. And that's one of the things on the table. Some kind of a trigger like a Title 42 that basically is going to allow no due process and just sending people back. Those people continue to come across and make efforts to come through within the ports of entry. And so that's why I don't think this is going to solve the problem. And you're talking about massive changes to immigration for one-time aid, foreign aid that's critically needed. But this is not the way to do it. So we do agree something needs to be done, but this needs to be a different conversation with a real negotiation.
Congresswoman, you talked about the idea that CHC members aren't here at the table enough. Can I broaden that question out a little bit? Do you think that President Biden is doing enough to reach out to Hispanic Democrats more broadly right now?
Well, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has had an initiative called CHC on the Road this year, and we've partnered with the Biden administration to go across the country to talk about a lot of the things that we have been able to do in the last Congress, whether it's lowering prescription drug prices, whether it's making sure we're investing in jobs for things like the Latino community construction jobs through the infrastructure bill, which we did when we went to New Mexico with Secretary Buttigieg. We were just in Houston, Texas with Vice President Harris talking about a lot of different things, whether it was mental health investments, women's reproductive rights. So we are doing outreach. More needs to be done.
I'm hearing about you're talking about your outreach. I'm asking about the president's outreach.
Well, this has been in combination with the White House. So the CHC partnered with the Biden-Harris administration to do this. But there's no doubt that the president and all of us need to do a better job to reach out to Latino communities early and often, all the time, not just in a campaign year, but in an off year, to make sure that people know their voices are heard, that they know what we're doing and what we're fighting for, but also to have the ability to be heard. And so I think this is an ongoing effort. And we know that the largest growing population are Latinos across the country.
Congresswoman, that's all the time we have for today, but something tells me we'll be talking about this well into the new year. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And after the break, inside China's blunt warning for the White House that it plans to retake Taiwan. Our own Kristen Welker joins me next with her exclusive reporting. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We've got some NBC exclusive new reporting today on what happened inside a recent high-stakes meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. According to 3 current and former U.S. officials, Xi delivered a blunt and candid message that he will reunify Taiwan with mainland China. But the timing of such an action had not been decided. Xi noted that it was his preference to take Taiwan peacefully and not by force. Following that 4-hour marathon meeting last month, President Biden was asked by reporters specifically about a potential invasion of Taiwan by China. Here's what he said.
Xi Jinping outlined the conditions under which China would attack Taiwan.
Look, I reiterate what I've said since I've become president, what every previous president of late has said, that we maintain the agreement that there is a one China policy, and that I'm not going to change that. That's not going to change. And so that's about the extent to which we discussed it.
Joining me now on set is the moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, who broke that story. And also with me is Bonny, director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So, Kristen, it sounds like that was not about all that was discussed about this. What more do you know about what the administration's reaction has been, policymakers' reaction? I mean, this happened a little while ago. What's going on behind the scenes since then?
Well, so we know that President Xi was very blunt. He was candid. He was not confrontational. And he basically said that he plans to reunify, that China plans to reunify Taiwan with the mainland. Look, this fits into what he has consistently said publicly, but Garrett, it lands differently when he is speaking directly to the president and against the backdrop of these tensions between the U.S. and China in the wake of that spy balloon incident. The whole purpose of this meeting was to try to bring down the temperature on what were mounting tensions. We are getting some reaction. The White House not responding, but Senator Lindsey Graham saying this: I will be working with Democratic and Republican senators to do two things quickly. First, create a robust defense supplemental for Taiwan. And second, draft pre-invasion sanctions from hell to impose on China if they take action to seize Taiwan. I believe there is strong bipartisan support to stand up to Chinese communist aggression. When you listen to what President Biden said there after the meeting, kind of reiterated the U.S. position as it relates to China and Taiwan. But of course, we know that this president has been asked about this, and he has said that, yes, he would be prepared to use the U.S. military if China were to make a move to try to take Taiwan. The White House has walked those comments back, as you know. But again, this was a comment, Garrett, that really that was noticed by officials in the room because of this fraught backdrop against which President Xi made that statement.
When I listened to this reporting with my congressional reporter hat on, I was thinking about the sanctions in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, too, where sanctions had not been as effective as everybody in Washington thought they would be at changing Putin's calculus. I wonder if it would be different with Xi. But I also wonder about this meeting in particular, because as you pointed out, this is all about lowering the temperature. And the other big takeaway from this was that they were going to reestablish military-to-military communications, which also seems not to have happened. So how is the administration, how should we evaluate the success of that meeting based on your reporting and what we already know?
I think the big success of that meeting was that it happened at all because the two leaders hadn't met in a year. They did agree to reestablish military-to-military communications. As you rightfully point out, that has not happened yet. They also reached an agreement to try to tackle the issue of fentanyl. And remember, President Biden said trust but verify. So the United States very much in a posture of looking at China with skepticism as it relates to some of those commitments. But again, Garrett, what's significant is that these two leaders got into the same room and talked and tried to reach an agreement on some of these really thorny
Always
issues.
rather have them talking than not talking.
That's right.
Kristen Welker, excellent reporting.
Garrett.
I want to turn to Bonny for some analysis here. So what's your reaction to this ominous warning by President Xi, the fact that they are having this conversation face-to-face in the same room about reuniting Taiwan with mainland China?
Well, thank you, Garrett. And it's also always great to be with Kristen, too. So in terms of Xi's warning, I don't think that's anything new. I don't view it as more ominous than before. We've known for some time that China has been investing in its capabilities to be able to take the island by force if needed. I do think it's important to think about the larger context in which Xi is providing that warning. The first I will point out is China is very worried about the upcoming Taiwan elections, as Kristen pointed out. And from their perspective, the current DPP presidential candidate and his running mate are viewed from China as more problematic than the current DPP president. So part of Xi's comments was signaling to the United States that we're very worried about the election and we have deep distrust of one of the political candidates. And I think two other layers on that. One is also from the Chinese perspective, they believe that the United States can intervene and shape the election, right? So obviously that is not the position of the Biden administration, but part of Xi communicating that to the United States is their hope on their part that the United States will intervene and shape the election outcomes. And the third factor I will add into this is when we look at Taiwan's current different political campaigns in Taiwan in that presidential election, there is one campaign that is running off of the narrative that a vote for one of the other candidates is a vote for war and a vote for their candidate is a vote for peace. So I think China amplifying the narrative of potential use of force against Taiwan is helping some of the candidates they would prefer more and taking down some of the candidates they prefer less.
It's a good reminder that all politics are local, even when you're talking about China and Taiwan. But speaking of context, I mean, how does the context of the wars that are happening right now, the hot wars in Ukraine and Israel, and America's stutter-stepping, let's say, support for our allies in those wars affect the calculus for Xi and for the Chinese Communist Party?
I think they are looking at U.S. support and U.S. involvement in those conflicts and trying to make their own assessments about what does that mean in terms of U.S. bandwidth, what does that mean in terms of how long the United States can support one of our allies and partners. But at the end of the day, when Xi Jinping, for example, looks at Taiwan, what he bases his calculus on, if we're talking about the use of force, is dynamics within Taiwan. And right now, I don't think China has assessed that the prospects of peaceful unification with Taiwan have been exhausted.
We reported yesterday on this intelligence community assessment that China tried to intervene and play around in some specific races in the 2022 midterm elections here in the U.S. Based on what you're describing, what are their influence operations like in Taiwan right now for those elections there?
There's a lot of reporting on different types of Chinese involvement. At the highest level, some of the reporting include, for example, doing an investigation on one of the fourth Taiwan presidential candidate that has now dropped out of the race, doing an investigation on his businesses in mainland China. And because of that and the potential fines that he would have received, we've seen the end result is he dropped out of the race. China would have preferred him to not be in the race because he would have taken away from some of the tickets, some of the voters that would have supported a ticket that Beijing would prefer more versus some of the other candidates. And then we're, of course, also seeing extensive cognitive warfare, social media campaigns, and we're seeing even reporting of people from China calling Taiwan voters, urging them to think in particular ways about the election.
Investigating the foreign business dealings of a presidential candidate. There is nothing new under the sun. Kristen Welker and Bonny, thank you both. And up next, the political ramifications of that major Colorado Supreme Court ruling disqualifying former President Trump from being on the 2024 primary ballot. Whew, your panel's next. We'll have a lot to talk about. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back as we return to the biggest political story of the day, that Colorado Supreme Court decision that Donald Trump should be disqualified from the ballot for engaging in the January 6th insurrection. Joining me now is Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Simone Sanders-Townsend, host of MSNBC's Simone, and starting soon, January 13th, the co-host of The Weekend, and Republican strategist Garrett Ventry. So, Tia, I'll start with you. How much do you think this Colorado ruling changes the 2024 landscape, or does it?
I think it's still too early to tell, because I really do think this is something that the Supreme Court is going to have to iron out. And quite frankly, the Colorado Supreme Court is an outlier. Many other courts have asked to answer this question or similar questions about Trump or other Republicans and have basically kept those lawmakers' names on the ballot. So I think it's, first of all, we've got to wait for the Supreme Court. Who knows how quickly they'll work. But the odds are that the Supreme Court might overturn what the Colorado Supreme Court.
In the meantime, we might see other states act on this, too. So, Garrett, if you're the Trump campaign, I mean, they are, to me, it appears performatively upset about this. But is this not the best-case scenario for them? They've got Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, all out defending the former president on the campaign trail a month before Iowa.
Absolutely. I think there's two things here. I think legally they think that this is an unprecedented action here, and they think the Supreme Court will weigh in their favor here. You're talking about, we've seen, continued lawfare against President Trump. You've had 4 indictments, 2 impeachments in the last couple of years against him. The issue is, if you look at this politically, this has not only helped him in the primary where he's up 50 to 60 points against his next closest challenger. You're talking about his opponents having to defend him now. Even folks like Chip Roy, who he was in a back and forth, is defending him now. But you're talking about, it hasn't hurt him in the general election. Your CNBC polling has him up 4 points. Fox has him up 5 points. New York Times has him up 2 points. So clearly, I think this has backfired continually every time they've gone after President Trump.
Well, Simone, to that point, I mean, if the goal of the people who brought this suit was to see Donald Trump not be president, is this the best way to do it, or does something like this backfire in the minds of the voters who will ultimately have to make this decision?
Well, I think the goal of the 6 individuals who, on behalf of Crew, brought the lawsuit was to say that Donald Trump should be disqualified from being on the Colorado ballot because of his role in the insurrection that occurred on January 6th. So if that was their goal, they were in fact successful. I don't believe that these 6 people in Colorado were thinking this is going to stop Trump from being president. To Tia's point, Colorado is the only litigation that has been successful, where Donald Trump has been disqualified. It has been dismissed in a number of other places where this suit has been brought by various people for various other grounds. There's pending legislation in at least 7 states right now. Some of them really matter, like for the general election, like Arizona or Wisconsin, right? So I do think that this is the place where the Supreme Court will weigh in. And frankly, if it's still a contest. When it comes to the primary, the Republican primary, as a former strategist, it just blows my mind that time and time again, these candidates just refuse to even just get a little bit in the ring with Donald Trump. Even Chris Christie, who has been very, I would argue, critical, to be kind, of Donald Trump throughout this race, he could have even said, hey, you know what? I think the Supreme Court needs to weigh in here, and we need to let the court decide. Instead, even he leapt to what it felt like Donald Trump's defense.
Garrett, to that point, I mean, the merits of this case are what they are, but have the other candidates missed their opportunity here to make more of the legal vulnerabilities that Donald Trump does have in this race?
Well, I think one thing real quick here, they're saying he committed insurrection. None of the indictments have charged him with insurrection. He was actually acquitted in the United States Senate on that same charge.
Right, we spent 15 minutes on that.
So there's that aspect.
But also the definition of, I mean, if we just look at what the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says, it doesn't say you have to be charged or anything like that. There's nothing about criminality associated in it. It just said, did you participate?
Our constitutional expert this afternoon, it feels so long ago now, described this as being in new snow, but I want to let you finish that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one there. I think the issue is this, that Donald Trump has such a stranglehold on the Republican Party. We've seen this since, we saw on January 6th, right, in 2021, Kevin McCarthy calling for censure of Donald Trump. 10 days later, he's at Mar-a-Lago for a photo op.
Right.
So you've seen this over and over again where people in the Republican primary think there's a lane to defeat Donald Trump. And there simply isn't. I think it'll be the autopsy of every single Republican challenger, whether Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley. So I think they could take that path, but the path for criticizing Donald Trump is the 1% to 3% path right now for Asa Hutchinson, Chris Christie. When you're eating up 69, 70% of the vote here, it's just very tough.
Tia, I want to bring Tia back into this conversation. I think a lot about how we talk about this. I mean, I write all these scripts for things like Nightly News and the Today Show, where we shorthanded, right? Donald Trump's legal troubles. Every time you add a case like this, the relative strengths or weaknesses we'll find out over time. Does it cheapen the impact of something like the Georgia case, where that's a huge RICO prosecution, or the Jack Smith case here in Washington? These things are not all equal, but the tonnage increases and the distinctions decrease.
Well, I think they're not all equal because all of these cases kind of have pretty distinct either their origins or what they're charging him with or what they relate to. You know, we've got New York's case is much different than the case down in South Florida, which is much different than the case in Georgia. And then there's a federal case regarding the 2020 election. I think a lot of the people who want Trump held accountable are not necessarily taking long-term political calculations, even though that's what he says and he's playing the victim. I think in a lot of these cases, there are prosecutors, there are grand juries who have said, we've looked at the evidence and we think that there's crimes that have been committed that he should be held accountable for. And that's what these cases should symbolize, and then let it play out. But unfortunately, they're being held in a political bubble where Trump is able to use them to his advantage.
One of the things that unites, I think, all these issues is many of them, if not all of them, could end up in front of the Supreme Court. And to that end, Simone, how important is this moment, or what we're going to experience over the next 6 months or so, to the credibility of the court, which is already so strained by, what the scandals involving, where justices are getting money from, to people's views over the Dobbs decision. I mean, the court is in a spot now, like I've certainly never seen in my political lifetime.
A precarious position, to say the least. And to that end, in an arena where the facts of the case should be the only thing of which the justices are considering when they are making decisions, what the law says, what the Constitution says, whether we would like to believe, whether people want to admit it or not out loud, I do think that political calculations have previously and will in these upcoming cases make their way into the conversations, at least, that the justices have amongst themselves when deliberating about these cases, because the credibility of the court is on the line in a way that never before in our history. The United States Supreme Court is being challenged by members of Congress. When you have members of Congress, of the Senate, who are petitioning, the Chief Justice to come before them to speak because of the ethics issues that are being brought to bear due to good journalism, I think this is uncharted territory.
I want to get Garrett in on this because you're a former Senate Judiciary guy. What do you make? Is the court up to this moment? I mean, they do not want to be in a political spotlight as hot as the one they're about to be in over the next couple of months.
Yeah, I think personally knowing a couple of the justices here, I think you've got to take a step back here. Most of the cases the Supreme Court rules on, about 50% of them are 9-0 decisions. 70-something% of them are 7-2 decisions. There's a lot of agreement there. The ones that get the most coverage, obviously, are the 5-4, 6-3. I do think all of the justices, whether a Republican-appointed justice or a Democrat-appointed justice, take their job very seriously. They try. Neil Gorsuch says very famously, judges wear robes, not capes. And so I think when judges step in the courtroom there, they take it very seriously. And I don't actually think most of these justices take politics into consideration.
It is becoming my working theory that what happens down the street here in Northeast Washington is going to be as important to this race as anything we see on the campaign trail. But guys, we've got to leave it there for now. Tia, Simone, Garrett, thank you all for coming in, and thank you all for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Sam Brock in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.